Welcome everyone. Hi, I'm Molly Billow, Training Advisor here at CBT Nuggets, and I want to introduce Ben Finkel, who is going to cover the topic of Intro to AngularJS. Hi Ben, and another piece we want to let you know about, we're going to record this webinar. It's going to be available on our blog. And also be sure to use the chat pod to submit questions. We'll cover them at the end of the webinar. Okay, so take it away, Ben. Bye.
Hi, Molly. Thanks so much. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So like you already know and Molly already said, this is an introduction to AngularJS. And I hope everyone's having a great summer, enjoying the soccer tournament. I think AngularJS is a really cool technology. It's a really cool summertime project to sit down and learn how to use AngularJS. Because for reasons like I'll talk about later, it really can integrate with whatever it is you're using, whatever you're doing for web development really easily. So just a brief overview of the structure of what I'm going to talk about here today. I am going to take a few minutes on a couple of slides and just talk about some of the history of AngularJS and real high-level overview of what it is and what it's trying to accomplish, some of the problems that AngularJS is trying to solve. And then once I'm done there, I'm going to move over onto some live code samples and we'll actually get our hands dirty, so to speak, and learn about how to write some AngularJS code, see some of it in action, and you can see how really easy and simple and clean it is to use. So hopefully you get something interesting and useful out of this. I know when I first learned Angular, I did out of this, so I'm really excited to talk about it here. So the first question a lot of people want to know is, what is AngularJS? What the heck is it? And AngularJS is an open source client-side MVC framework for web development, which is a whole lot of words but doesn't tell you a whole lot actually when you listen to it. So I like to start with a story that Brad Green, one of the engineers at Google who works on the Angular project, tells about 2009 when they were working on a product called Google Feedback. And they ran into an issue with their front-end code there. They had around 17,000 lines of code, and it was just a heavy testing, debugging nightmare to work with all this code. They didn't know what to do with it. And a guy in the room, Mishko Hevery, raises his hand and he says, you know what, I've been working on this open source framework. I could rewrite all this front-end code a lot simpler than what you've got here. And they said, okay, we'll give you a couple weeks. And he came back a couple weeks later and he had turned 17,000 lines of code into 1,500. And it was simple and clean and easy to read and easy to debug and very importantly easy to test. And that's when they knew, Google knew they had something on their hands and AngularJS was born. So it's kind of a neat thing. Google themselves use it right there at their Googleplex. And the primary thing, the number one problem that AngularJS is trying to solve, and that actually all web development frameworks are trying to solve, is this idea that HTML is really a static language. HTML, when it was developed however many thousands of years ago by the ancient Egyptians, was never really intended to handle the kind of dynamic, powerful web applications that we use today. Netflix and Amazon, these really great, cool sites that we're all used to using, weren't in their heads. It's really a markup language for a static document. So JavaScript came along at some point, and that's intended to sort of handle that issue. JavaScript is the functionality side of web development. But if you've worked with JavaScript at all, you know that it can be a little bit clumsy. It's a very loose kind of programming language, and you really need to have a strong discipline to produce good, solid JavaScript code. So on top of that, everyone sort of needs to do the same thing in web development, at least a lot of the times we do. So there's no reason not to have JavaScript libraries out there, things that do this stuff for us and make our job a lot easier. And that's what AngularJS has tried to do. It's tried to take a JavaScript library that turns static HTML documents into dynamic, declarative HTML templates. Now, this is nothing new if you've been working in web development. Everyone's out there doing it. That's what view engines essentially are in MVC frameworks. But Angular takes a slightly different approach to it. It not only runs on the client side, inside of your client browser, but it actually runs post-processing of the browser. So the browser actually gets to parse and process these HTML documents before Angular does. And that's a little point, but it's really important because it means that AngularJS applications syntactically have to be solid, sound HTML, JavaScript, and CSS pages. So Angular extends HTML, the language. It extends HTML and allows it to do these dynamic, powerful things that if you sat down and thought about it and you were developing it today, you would want HTML to do. What's cool about that is it makes your HTML documents very easy to read, and we'll see that in a minute when we get into the code. So AngularJS, some of the features of it, and specifically what it does, is they call it a super heroic JavaScript MVW framework. That's right from the AngularJS site, by the way. And we call it an MVC framework most of the time, Model View Controller. Some people insist that it's actually a Model View model framework. The folks at Angular, they're not too hung up on the label. They like to call it an MVW, where the W stands for whatever works for you. This idea being that it's really focused on the model in the view and getting your data onto your view, into your HTML document, and getting information back from your HTML document and into your model. The third piece there, the controller, the view model, whatever you want to think about there, doesn't much matter. It's not really important. You've got JavaScript there that allows you to do that. So a couple of neat features about AngularJS. It's entirely client-side, like I already mentioned. It runs entirely in JavaScript, which means it runs on your web browser. And because of that, it really fits nicely with any existing technology that you have in your technology stack. It's at the end of the line. So your HTML, your JavaScript, whatever it is that you're writing, AngularJS is going to fit in with it really nicely and really well. AngularJS is also very lightweight. And what I mean by that is to use it, all you have to do is include a link to the AngularJS library. And once you've done that, it's a very small library. It's like 100 kilobytes. You're using AngularJS. That's all you need to do. The code is very simple. It is very concise. It's terse. So it doesn't take up a lot of screen real estate to look at the code. And typically it's very clean and very obvious. It's easy to understand what it's doing. AngularJS is also really super extensible. Everything that AngularJS does, because it's in JavaScript, is A, open source, but B, they introduce a lot of hooks into AngularJS so that you can extend it yourself. You can build on to their library and use the features of AngularJS for your own application. So things like custom factories or custom directives that you want to write, it's easy enough to write those and they'll integrate right with your AngularJS application. And then last on my list there, but maybe one of the most important points, is that AngularJS is very testable. AngularJS promotes a really good sound separation of responsibility in your code. And that means that you have these small chunks of code that are easy to unit test. In fact, Angular ships with an end-to-end unit test scenario runner. So you can easily test and debug your code. And this is so important for developers. I know when I'm developing, I'm kind of lazy about it. I'm terrible, actually, about testing my code. It's one of the things as developers that we are always supposed to be better at doing. AngularJS makes it a lot easier and a lot cleaner and simpler to do. So some of the specific things that AngularJS does. The big one, HTML templating. AngularJS turns your static HTML documents into an HTML template. And it does that using HTML syntax. Like I mentioned before, your HTML has to run through the browser before Angular can get a hold of it. So that means you're using HTML as it already exists. It's not some new abstracted language that you have to learn. It's just stuff that looks really like HTML or XML that you're used to working with already. Angular also uses plain old JavaScript, and we'll see that in action as well. It uses, through the miracle of, I call it the miracle, dependency injection. It lets you write plain old JavaScript code, plain old JavaScript objects, and then it injects the dependencies that you need. So you're not importing and bringing in a lot of libraries. You just are writing plain old JavaScript for both your model and your controllers. A couple other neat features that Angular has. It has form validation. So HTML5 has a lot of great client-side form validation built into it. AngularJS expands on those. And it's really, there's a lot of good reasons to use form validation on the client side, localization among the biggest one. As I always like to say, dates and numbers in the country that you're in may not be the same as dates and numbers in the country that I'm in. So you want to validate those things right on the client side. AngularJS also includes the Promises API. That's a design pattern for asynchronous calls and callbacks that makes sure that you can handle asynchronous calls using promise objects. And lastly, I listed there directives, which is a little bit, kind of weird, like it's just hanging out there. You might not know what a directive is. But directives are the code that extend your document object model, your DOM, and let you write cool, powerful AngularJS applications. You're going to see that right now in just a minute. So I'm going to go ahead and try to switch over to my code here. And you should all be looking at the plunker that I've got up on screen now. And this plunker is pretty simple. If you've written any HTML before, nothing here should be too outlandish. There's a couple of things you won't recognize. But I want to make a couple of points. I love this little Angular Hello World application. And that's what it is. It's the Hello World application. So for starters, you'll notice that the only file in this plunker is an HTML file. I've written any JavaScript to do this. I have a link to the Angular JavaScript library right here. I'm just pulling it right off the Google API. But other than that, everything that happens is built into Angular, the library itself. So a couple of things. First of all, I've declared something called an ng-app right here on this div. And all that's doing is wrapping my code and telling it that this is where the Angular application is. You can actually have multiple ones of these on a single DOM. And they exist, they operate in their own namespaces. They all get something called a root scope. I'll show you that a little bit later. Inside of that application, I've got an input box with only one unusual decorator on it, something called ng-model, and that's set equal to name. Well, we don't know what that is, we don't know what that does, but we'll understand in a minute. Because right below that, I've got an h1 element, and inside the handlebars here, I reference name. So what's going to happen when I start typing in over here? You can see as I key into my input box, my document automatically updates. It dynamically updates with whatever I've typed into my box. So here's what's going on. This is really cool. When I declared ng-model equals name, I bound this input box to a variable called name in the background JavaScript. I didn't have to create that variable. I didn't have to declare the JavaScript, although I could. Angular simply knew, hey, I need a place to store whatever is keyed into this input box. And ng-model is the decorator that does that. Conversely, when I wanted to spit out that variable, I put it inside of the handlebars here, which is what's called an Angular expression. So instead of writing the word name out on screen, Angular recognized that I actually wanted the value of the name variable, and it spits that right out on screen. And importantly, Angular is watching this input box because I bound it to the model, and it's updating it right on the fly. So whatever I type into this box is immediately stored into that variable, and it's immediately reflected on my page. If you're good with JavaScript, you might say, well, okay, I could write this myself, but the question is, could you write it yourself and make it look this clean and this easy to understand, and with literally zero JavaScript, custom JavaScript written in the background? I love this about it. You can do all this really cool stuff. Angular already knows how to handle it. So this is an example of an HTML template that we talked about. This is a dynamic HTML template that we built in AngularJS. And it implements what we call two-way data binding. So you might be used to the idea of data binding where the input box value is bound back to this variable name. Well, the two-way part comes in down here. The name value is also bound back down here on the display. So we have it two ways. We both get the data into our model, in this case name, and we get the value out of our model and onto the view, which this HTML template represents. These two little ng- things here are those directives that I talked about a minute ago. So they look just like HTML attributes, and that's important, but they're actually in Angular's language, in Angular's vocabulary. They're called directives, and they direct Angular how to manipulate and how to handle the document object model. So I'm going to open up a slightly more complex example now. And this is one I've called controller, and it's sort of the same thing. A couple of extra things. The first thing I want to point out is notice that it's already filled in with the name Becky. How'd that happen? Well, I've got my ng-app here, and I've set it equal to something called my app. We'll talk a little bit about that. But more importantly, I've added in another directive called ng-control, and I've pointed it to something called sample CTRL. So now I've created a reference to a controller, and at this point I've had to create some background JavaScript that I wrote myself. Brought that up on screen here. So what you can see is that I've essentially declared a controller on top of my app, and I've created a variable called name, and I've set it equal to Becky. So when Angular brings up this app over here, you can see that this name value is already populated with the value Becky. Still works just the same as before. Whatever I type in here gets printed out right on screen, but it's being stored in this name variable. Now one of the cool things that's going on here is this little scope object that I'm referencing, and that gets passed into this controller. I've actually created the name variable inside of this scope object, and that's really important. One of the cool things that Angular does for you, does for your JavaScript, is it creates these namespaces where your values, your variables, can exist. So a big no-no in JavaScript programming is having variables inside of your root global namespace. Angular creates an infrastructure so that that doesn't have to happen. You don't have to worry about that. And it does that with something called scope. The other cool thing that's happening here is you'll notice this is a function declaration if you're familiar with JavaScript. I'm passing in this scope service, which is an Angular specific service. It's doing it with something called dependency injection. So if I wanted the HTTP service, I could also just type it in here in my declaration, and without any other changes, I would now have access to that HTTP service inside of this function if I wanted to do something with it. All of the different services in AngularJS are injectable. They allow you to simply define in your function declaration what your dependencies are, and AngularJS injects those dependencies into that function. It's really cool. Otherwise, everything else here works the same. ng-model, handlebars to expose the name variable, and it updates right as we go. Pretty cool. A couple other features to see on AngularJS when you're first getting into it. Here I'm showing off something called ng-repeat, which is a different type of directive. So I'm actually going to start with my controller. And it's essentially the same. I've declared this controller function. I initialize a new person value, set it equal to blank. That's this text box over here. I want it to start off blank. I also initialize a people array on which I include Ben and Lisa. Right? So again, simple JavaScript. I just said, hey, people equals Ben and Lisa, 2 strings. Back here on my HTML template, you can see that I've got a list item that says ng-repeat person in people. So now we're getting into the weeds here. But what I'm doing is I'm essentially iterating over the people array. There's an array I declared inside of my controller. And for every person object in it, I am spitting out the value, in this case person. So again, the handlebars show the value of that person. And by putting this on an li element, a list item element, inside of an unordered list, I get a cool list of the names inside that array. I'm also doing something else really cool here that I really like. I've got a button up above that says add, and the ng-click directive on that button calls a function add person. So stop right here and take a look at this. You may not be especially familiar with Angular, but if you were reading this for the first time, if you sat down in front of this code, you might actually be able to look at this and understand what's going on. It's not totally obscure, it's not totally abstract what's happening. I'm repeating this element for every person inside of people, and I'm adding a person when I click this button. And it's so easy to do. Notice there's very, very little code here. On the flip side, there's very little code here as well. That add person function that I reference right here in my ng-click shows up right here where I declare it on that scope service that I talked about. I simply declare the function, and the function does what? It pushes a value onto the array, and then make sure to blank out the text box again. So that easy, with that simple little command, when I type in another name here, and I click add, it immediately shows up on my page. And again, this is two-way data binding in action. So this input box, the model is new person, which I get a handle on down here, new person. and I push it onto the array. Once that array is updated, it instantaneously, no additional function has to be called. This array, even this ng-repeat, automatically, instantaneously updates with whatever value I've added in there. So it's really, really cool. It's really fun and fast and easy to build these dynamic web applications that are real responsive. You can imagine how you would hand off your entire data model to AngularJS and handle all of your templating, all of your view rendering with Angular as opposed to your view engine on your server side. Another example here, I just want to show off a little bit of something called the inheritance of the scope. So I've got almost the same kind of thing. I've actually doubled up on that little control I have. So here's my new person array. But also here's a second one, and this is goodbye as opposed to hello. And there's something really important here that I'm showing off, and that's the fact that this ng controller, this first one, hello, is a parent of the goodbye controller. See, so this div is inside of that div. And that's really important for what's called scope inside of AngularJS. The structure of your document object model really affects how values are handled in the scope of AngularJS. So notice that these are both bound to new person. But they're inside of different controllers. When I start typing in here, you can see that it updates both text boxes because they're both bound to new person. And if I add one to one list, it shows up on both lists because both lists are bound to this people array. Same thing down here. If I call Frank and add it on, you see it ends up on both lists. Now the reason this happens is because back here in my function declarations for my controllers, I don't declare a separate scope for the people array. People only exists on the hello controller function inside of this scope service. And that means it's being inherited down the document object model tree. Goodbye controller, remember I said a moment ago, is actually a child of hello controller. So that means that these values, this people array, is being handed down here, and I don't have to duplicate its value. Everything that happens on this array also happens on this array. They reflect the same thing. Now that behavior may be desirable. That might be what you want. A lot of times you're going to want your values inherited down this array of scopes. But other times you won't. And here I've got the same thing. You'll notice my template doesn't look any different. But I've made one small difference, and that's in the background on my goodbye controller, I've declared another instance of new person and people. Doesn't look like much. It's a very small change, a couple lines of code. But what it means is that these are now, even though they're a parent and child relationship, their values inside of their scope are totally different. So when I type into one and add it to one list, it doesn't inherit down to the second one. It's a really important concept, and it's really key to understand the relationship between AngularJS and your document object model and how it creates these scope services, these scope variables, that apply only to specific portions of your document object model. Scope is so huge and so important when you're working with JavaScript, and AngularJS makes it really easy to do. So only a couple of minutes left here. I just want to review a couple of things that I talked about because I went over a lot and I went over some of it pretty fast. But AngularJS turns your HTML template into a declarative dynamic document. So you can sit down, you can look at this code, and you can say, all right, this is where the new person variable is because I can see new person right now. This button is going to add a person to it. And that's cool. That's different than, say, jQuery, just to choose one to pick on. jQuery is all in JavaScript in the background. If this button caused an add person event to fire in jQuery, you wouldn't know by looking at the HTML. You'd have to go into the JavaScript and search through it to find out if any events were hooked up to this button. So this declarative syntax makes it a lot easier to read without you or other developers in the future who have to reread your code trying to figure out what's going on. AngularJS also creates these cool scope services that are tied to the structure. So when you create a new AngularJS application with this little statement here, You get a totally new namespace, a totally new scope that you can operate within. And every time you do something like create a new controller, that creates a child scope that you can either inherit values down, like we saw in that one example, or you can create new overriding values to make sure that you have independent variables. Either way, things are defined within their own scope, and they make their own scope separate in the separate namespaces. So I hope you found some of that interesting and informative. Like I said, I know I went through quite a bit, and it can be a little bit difficult to take that all in. So I think I can return back to our slides here, and I'm going to hand it back over to Molly at this point. She's been taking note of your questions. Any questions or anything interesting that you want to know, I'm here to answer it for you.
Hey, thanks so much, Ben. We do have some questions, and I'll let you know. The first one is, can I use AngularJS with my existing .NET web application?
Yeah, you can. So, and that's really a great point to highlight. Like I mentioned, AngularJS runs entirely on the client side, and it runs entirely post the browser rendering. So that means that you can actually fit AngularJS really nicely with whatever MVC stack or whatever web technology stack you're already using. It's traditionally the past couple of years been part of something they call the mean stack, but there's no reason that you can't pump out AngularJS from any web development server-side technology, and that includes .NET, PHP, whatever you're doing on the server side, Ruby on Rails. I like to think of AngularJS as being a sort of small MVC application inside of the view of another server-side MVC application. You know.
Cool. Okay, we got another one here. What does the Angular refer to in the name?
I like that question because I know the answer. Angular is a reference to the fact that originally AngularJS was an extension of HTML. It was trying to turn HTML into a templating language. And the syntax HTML are little elements inside of Angular brackets. And so they wanted to call it AngularJS as a kind of subtle nod to that history and that origination of AngularJS, the library. So yeah, it's a reference to Angular brackets that you use in HTML.
Can it be used with jQuery? We've got a question about that.
It can, yes. You know, there's I think a lot of people approach it with the idea of, do you use Angular or jQuery? Do you use Angular or this other library that I use? But actually, you should be using Angular with these things. And AngularJS itself includes a small, lightweight jQuery library called JQLite to do DOM manipulation, document object model manipulation. And the point there is that jQuery is really good at doing DOM manipulation. So Angular doesn't try to reproduce that functionality. It includes some jQuery that allows you to do that. And you can also, you know, you can include the jQuery library right in your project and use it real cleanly and real easily with AngularJS. They don't step on each other's toes at all.
Okay, and we got time for one more. What browsers does AngularJS support?
AngularJS supports only modern browsers for the most part. I believe IE8 and IE9, and of course the more recent additions of Firefox and Chrome and Safari. It relies heavily on JavaScript, obviously. It also leans heavily on HTML5. So it will work with a lot of different browsers, but generally only ones that have come out in the past, 3 to 5 years. Older browsers than that, it's going to run into some trouble with.
All right. That's all we have time for. I do want to remind everybody that the webinar is going to be available on our blog at blog.cbtnuggets.com. And I want to thank everybody for attending. We really appreciate you being here. And thank you, Ben. It was great to have you.
Thank you, Molly.
Okay, take care, everybody.